Boker Tov, everybody, and good morning, all who are joining. Hi, Sarah. Hi, everybody. And we are beginning the book of Exodus. So I say this all throughout the next several parshayot. There's so much in these parshayot. I wish we could just slow it all down. Good thing we come back to it every year, so we get to revisit different aspects of it. And this week, in my reading through it, I found myself interested in the character of Moshe, of Moses, and his split identity, right? Like the ways in which his identity and the way he has grown up and been raised inform who he becomes as a leader and a prophet and later on in his life. So I'm going to share the screen so that we can look together at Moshe's origin story. All right, is the screen sharing working?
No.
Yeah, okay, good. So here we go. A certain member, I actually hate that translation. The word is just ish, a man, a person, a man of the house of Levi went and took as his wife a woman of Levi. The woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw how beautiful he was, she hid him for 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a wicker basket for him and caulked it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child into it and placed it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. And his sister stationed herself at a distance to learn what would befall him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe in the Nile while her maidens walked along the Nile. She spied the basket among the reeds and sent her slave girl to fetch it. When she opened it, she saw that it was a child, a boy, crying. She took pity on it and said, "This must be a Hebrew child." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get you a Hebrew nurse to suckle the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter answered, "Yes." So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will pay your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, who made him her son. She named him Moses, explaining, "I drew him out of the water." Sometime after that, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his kinsfolk and witnessed their labors. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinsmen. He turned this way and that, and seeing no one about, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, he found 2 Hebrews fighting. So he said to the offender, "Why do you strike your fellow?" He retorted, "Who made you chief and ruler over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Moses was frightened and thought, "Then the matter is known." When Pharaoh learned of the matter, he sought to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh. He arrived in the land of Midian and sat down beside a well. Okay, so we know this story. But my framing questions, and then I'll share the screen again and we can play with some midrash. How did the events of the first months of Moses's life set up a future identity crisis? Right? Like, in what ways does this origin story form his identity and set him up for an identity crisis? And we could even go deeper and say, at what point in this passage, and I could put it back up again, do you think Moses begins to identify as an Egyptian or as an Israelite, right? Like, are there moments in here that we might play with? Yeah, Ed, go ahead.
Yeah, I read an interesting Torah on this subject yesterday, and the writer points out that when Moses meets God at the burning bush, the first words out of Moses' mouth are, "Who am I?" And although you have to read into it what that means, but it could be that he didn't know, is he a Hebrew? Is he an Egyptian? His life, even after his birth, was totally conflicted between, he didn't know who his real mother was. He thought the daughter of Pharaoh was his mother. So he asked God, "Who am I?"
I love that. I had never made that connection. Whose Dvar Torah was that? Do you remember?
It was from the seminary, I think. No,
Okay, good. It's still sitting in my inbox then. Great. Anyone else want to jump in?
Well, I wonder whether he really had an identity crisis, because it seems like there are events that happen in the first month of his life where no one has any real recollection. And he ends up essentially being raised by his mother, which is how he knows he's Jewish and how he comes to smote the Egyptian. Probably the crisis, to me, if there is a crisis of this sort, is that he knows that he is beholden to the Egyptians for his being there. He knows that the Egyptians, out of grace or ignorance or whatever, took care of him because they had the wherewithal to take care of him, and his own family, his own tribe, his own people did not have the wherewithal to take care of him. So that, to me, is the conflict. How do you deal with the fact that you stand on a foundation that is not your own?
Beautifully put. Yeah. And each of the whole conversation veers into our, in our own ways, like our identities, our children's identities. It feels salient somehow. Anyone else want to jump in here? If not, I'll share a midrash. Yeah, Joel.
Like court Jews throughout history, Moses had a foot in both worlds.
Right, which sets him up for success in other ways in the story.
It also leaves him conflicted.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I like the comparison to the court Jews. It's good. And I wonder if for American Jews, right? And I feel like it comes up sometimes around like loyalty to Israel versus patriotism. There's like certain moments where, our identities can sometimes conflict, or, when the sympathy I may or may not have for Jews in the paper versus other, like there's ways in which our identities, our identities might come into conflict as well. All right, so let's see where the midrash might take us. And good morning, Norma. Glad you joined. Okay. And it came to, this is from Shemot Rabbah, Exodus Rabbah. And it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown up. That's the quote for that we just read. Moses, this is now the midrash. Moses was 20 years old at the time, and some say 40 years old. When Moses was grown up, doesn't everyone grow up? Meaning, why does the Torah bother to mention this? Rather, this tells you that he grew up in a manner unlike everyone else. All right, next phrase. He went out unto his brethren. That's the next part of our story. This righteous man went out of the palace precisely 2 times, and the Holy Blessed One wrote them one after another. And he went out the second day. That's the second one. So let's look at these 2. And he looked on their burdens. What is, and he looked? For he would look upon their burdens and cry and say, woe is me unto you. Who will provide my death instead of yours? I'll reread that. Who will provide my death instead of yours? For there is no more difficult labor than the labor of the mortar. And he would give of his shoulders, that is, use his shoulders to assist each one of them. Rabbi Eliezer, the son of Rabbi Yossi the Galilean, said, if he saw a large burden on a small person and a small burden on a large person, or a man's burden on a woman and a woman's burden on a man, or an elderly man's burden on a young man and a young man's burden on an elderly man, he would leave aside his rank and go and correct their burdens, but act as though he were assisting Pharaoh. The Holy One, blessed is he, said, you left aside your business. You left aside your business and went to see the sorrow of Israel and acted toward them as brothers act. I will leave aside the upper and the lower, that is, I will ignore the distinction between heaven and earth and talk to you. And so it is written, and when the Lord saw that Moses turned aside to see, the Holy Blessed One saw Moses, who left aside his business to see their burdens. Therefore God called unto him out of the midst of this bush. Okay, so I can keep these up, but I'll throw up these questions, right? How do each of these midrashim add to our picture of this period of Moses's life? And in these midrashim, does Moses identify more as an Israelite or more as an Egyptian? And in what ways does he make use of both aspects of his identity? I'll stop the share unless we want to climb back in. Should I read it one more time, or are we ready to chew on it? Curtis, I see your mouth going, but you're on mute. Anyone want to play again? Should I reread it? I can reread them. Like, in what ways is he, I guess the question really is, in seeing, in Moses's case, and we can extend it to ourselves, is seeing the injustice and seeing the Israelites' oppression. In what ways does his mixed identity or his grappling with his identity inform the way he responds in these passages? And I take it also to the next level of the second midrash, where he's helping, he's seeing each person in their rank and saying it's not fair, they have to stay in their rank. Like, is that, to me, that feels informed somehow by what we were saying before, that he's maybe confused and grappling inside of himself.
Yeah, I think he questions himself. I think he questions everything that's going on and not sure what is right and what is wrong, except what he believes in his heart is correct.
So there's something about his grappling in himself that causes him to question everything else that he's seeing and not just take it for granted.
Yeah.
Yeah, Joel.
The implication from the text is that Moses did not give a thought at all to the Israelites until he grew up. So he must have spent his youth in Pharaoh's palace, enjoying the benefits of being an adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter. And it's all the implication from the text, I think, is that he happened to go out and he had an epiphany and he realized, holy cow, these are my people. Because he then looks both ways. He very carefully scouts the terrain before he kills the Egyptian. So it's very much a sudden event, I think. And when we're left with the question of what caused him to suddenly develop this sense of compassion for the Israelites.
Yeah, and it's unclear. I appreciate what you're saying, that there's something about that the Midrash feels the need to take him out of the palace and to say that this was unusual, that there was like an eye-opening moment, right? Because otherwise, what happens that he suddenly at 20 or 40 felt this kind of compassion when he didn't, if he had grown up, going back and forth, playing among the workers or whatever. So there's something, it reminds me of like Aladdin, anyone watch Aladdin with your kids or grandkids, right? Like, the princess has to come out of the palace and only when she sees how the people live does she realize, right? Does she learn something about herself? So I think that's what they're getting at. I like that you noticed that, Joel. And for us, yeah, go ahead, Mindy.
Oh, I'm just building on what Joel said. There seems to be an emphasis, right? Things are in quotes here. When Moses was grown up, he went out onto his brethren, and he looked on their burdens and he looked, it's like there seems to be a great deal of emphasis here placed on those passages. So I agree with Joel, and I think the Midrash plays on that as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm pulling up the text again. This is now the Torah text, right? So this is he's no longer a baby. He's come out of the basket, and then sometime after that, Vayhi bayamim hahem, after some days, in those days, like that's all we got. We don't know if it's 20
Right.
years, 10 years, a week. We don't know, right? But then Vayigdal Moshe, that after he'd grown up, whatever that means, right? And so, yeah, so the Midrash is picking up on little bits and pieces of the next few verses, and filling in for us a little bit.
I think one of the things the Midrash is doing is it's drawing upon the section of the Torah involving the killing of the Egyptian, and saying that Moses, for a period of time, maybe for his life, was someone who had strong impulses that were good impulses, and someone who acted upon them. And the Midrash makes up these scenarios in which he acts upon his impulses. In this case, within the confines of I guess, being in an Egyptian supervised work gang, it sounds like. But to me, the significant thing is that he has an impulse and he acts on it. And he acts on it in a very specific, forthright, clear way, which is related to his good impulse, which then resonates with a lot of what happens in the Torah thereafter.
Yeah, and I find my eye drawn to this section down here. He looked upon their burdens. What is it? What does that mean? And he looked, for he would look upon their burdens and cry and say, woe is me unto you. I don't have this in the Hebrew. I would like to look at it in the Hebrew, but who will provide my death, my death instead of yours? What are we doing with that? That's like, what's going on here? If he doesn't know if he's Egyptian or Israelite, if he doesn't know which side of this he's on, what is going on for him here? Is it that he like doesn't know which side, like if he is he going to die as an Egyptian? Is he going to die as Israelite? Is that what he like? Who am I going to live as? Which community am I going to live as a part of? Is that what he's asking? I'm asking genuinely. I'm struck by that line.
Yeah, I am too. I don't quite,
Or maybe, why do I get to have the life that I have, and why do you have the life that you have?
Ooh, Sarah, I like that. Why do I get to have this life and you're in that life? And then what? And then that informs how he shows up, or like what? Build on that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting though, because he seems to see the injustice, but work in it in sort of a micro way, right? He's not going to Pharaoh. He has access to the palace, but he's not trying to change the structure of what's going on. He's not trying to advocate for the Hebrews, but he's trying to rearrange their burdens and sort of help them on the ground. It does seem like an inner conflict.
Spoken as a federal prosecutor. Yes. Yes, absolutely. I love that you're noticing that. It's like he's identifying so deeply and it resonates. And here we are like heading into Martin Luther King Jr. weekend, right? So like there's something about like his identifying with the oppressed and feeling like he's going in the midrash, he's like literally out there, like it's like in our day, he would be out there with the slave workers, right? But not, like you said, necessarily using his power in other ways, if that was possible. Or maybe the story has to unfold the way it does in order for it to be possible. So maybe in our last minute, I'll bring Ibn Ezra. For those of us who were here last week, I feel like this one flows so powerfully out of our conversation last week about like why bad things happen. What is God's role in the bad things that happen in our life? Does everything have a purpose? All right. So here's Ibn Ezra, who says, God's designs are subtle indeed. It may well be that God arranged the whole affair so as to have Moses grow up in the palace at a high intellectual level, rather than in the debased environment of a slave. After all, he killed the Egyptian because he acted with violence, and saved the daughters of Midian from the shepherds who acted violently, so that they could water their flocks from their meager water. Moreover, had Moses grown up among his fellows, and they knew him since his youth, they would not have revered him, because they would have considered him one of them.
Huh.
Yeah, that last line striking, right? Had Moses grown up among his fellows and they knew him since his youth, they would not have revered him because they would have considered him one of them. All right, so I'll stop the share. And Joel, you want to reflect or share?
The thought that I had is that Moses obviously knew he was Hebrew. Although he grew up in the palace, he knew he was Hebrew because it refers to him witnessing went out to his kinsfolk, one of his kinsmen. So he really had a foot in both worlds.
But they didn't know it, is what you're saying, so put that together with the, you're saying that he knew who he was, but the rest of the Israelites didn't know.
That's an interesting question. Did the Israelites know that he was Hebrew? I don't.
By the way, I'm very suspicious of that text. I'm not convinced he really knew who he was until the burning bush incident, because to me that feels like the narrator's voice telling us he went out to his kinsmen, but we don't see Moshe saying, "Hey, kinsman."
Well, that would be more of a mark in Moses's favor then. If he killed the Egyptian who was beating the slave, he did it not because it was one of his kinsmen, but because it was wrong.
Yeah, that's fair. I'm sort of switching the whole, my little supposition switches the whole conversation. Let's assume that he knows that he's conflicted. Yeah. Anyone else want to jump in? I'm interested in this last line because it strikes me as to how we show up with one another, and this goes to something we were talking about last Friday night about how we see each other and don't see each other. And, if are we so used to how we operate? And maybe this goes back to what you were saying, Sarah, right? Like if I know that this is my class, my milieu, my people, and they know me, then are we able to actually step out of our stories in a way that's helpful? Or do we actually need to, is that why it's sometimes easier to help? I have a friend who's so deep, she lives in the upper, in the city with me. She's so deeply involved in homelessness in India. And I've said to her, like, there are homeless people right here, like in our city, and she's like, yeah, it just doesn't call on me in the same way. Right. And is there something about helping the other? Is that part of what's going on here? Or is there something about being able to be seen as an outsider that helps us in a different way? Or is it more helpful to be an insider? Yeah, Debbie.
Do you think that Moses,
Debbie and then Bob.
do you think that Moses being brought up by his true mother, all the years that she possibly could have told him who he really was? And so, it seems unreal that she wouldn't have, or even if she hadn't, knowing that she was Jewish and she was his mother. She brought him up as a mother. He had to have related to her and to the problems of the Israelites. That just seems like a normal thing.
Well argued. You can certainly argue that he must have known. Yeah.
My thought is that I think he did know that he was Jewish, but I think that the storyline really is about the fact that the Jews had become a truly oppressed people, and it took somebody who was able to grow up in the luxury of a royal household, who was trained in the notion of being an effective person and trained in the notion of doing maybe not what he thought was right, but doing what he wanted to do. And it took someone like that to have a sense of leadership, a sense of power outside of the context of growing up as a Jew with a Jewish family in Egypt.
Yeah. And Bernie, go ahead.
I just, it's not Nachumish, but I guess it's another midrash that that the Hebrews spoke Hebrew, and his mother raised him in the Hebrew language. He therefore knew that he was Jewish because he spoke the language. Mama Lashon was Hebrew, not Egyptian.
Beautiful. So certainly at least some of the Midrashim have him know exactly who he is. And maybe that ties back to what Ed was saying. Like maybe he knew who he was, and also but how do you put that together, right? Like how do you hold both parts of your identity? And so coming back to actually what Sarah was saying, like maybe actually he doesn't in this moment, maybe that's part of his growing up, right? Maybe in this moment, all he can do is hit kill the one and according to the Midrash, help everybody, step in with the workers. But actually maybe the systemic piece is what comes up even later in life for him. Like the more he matures and the more he grows, he realizes that he has to fix the system. And maybe that's how we can read later on in the story when he does go back with Aaron into the palace and to face the Pharaoh who raised him, and say like, hey, let my people go. This is not right. Maybe it just takes him longer to get there. And maybe it's because I'm in the moment of life where I'm raising teenagers and I see a certain level of rage at injustice, which is appropriate and good. And I want that in them. And knowing that later on in life, watching, us at a different stage, holding our rage in a different way or wanting to be involved in a different way. And, there's like ways that we show up as activists. And so I invite all of us to just take this Torah. Yeah, Mindy, go ahead. And then I'll tie us up. Go ahead.
Maybe, the comment of who am I, maybe it's more not so much about identity between Hebrew and Egyptian, but who am I to be appointed like the social justice leader? The one who actually is the one fighting the oppression.
Yeah,
who am I really to be the one? I'm just Moses. I'm just, maybe that's his inner struggle as opposed to identity being associated with the people.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. So let that be our question for the day then. Who am I, right? And how might we take this Torah about fighting for justice and feeling like we're part of a people, and also wrestling with our own conflicting identities, whether that's, as parents and grandparents and workers and colleagues and, all of the different relationships, the way we're pulled, or it's just Jews and Americans and the tension between that. May these questions help us stir up to live up to Moses' legacy, and as we head into Martin Luther King Jr.'s Memorial Weekend, and also the yahrzeit of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel this week, that all of these great leaders should help us inform figuring out who we are and how we show up in the world to help one another as well. I'm so glad to be learning with all of you this morning. So have a great day, and Shabbat Shalom to those who I won't see.
Shabbat Shalom, Yashikar.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.